A few years ago, Michael gave me this wonderful old lathe. Thanks again, Michael. And I wanted to show you what it looked like then, when it first came here, but I just can't find the video clips. Very frustrating. The lathe had been stored in a shed for many years, which would be fine, of course, except the shed was wooden and it rotted away. And by the time I saw it, the walls had fallen in and the roof was resting on the lathe and everything was thick with wet rust. But we brought it back here anyway, and much wire brushing and dismantling was done. But I realised then that there were some vital parts missing and the bed was quite worn, so I covered it with a tarp and did other things instead, and 3 years went past just like that. But I do really need a lathe for my windmill project and other things, of course, so I'm going to try to get it going again if I can. And of course I probably would be much better off getting a much more modern lathe, one with variable speed drive and high speed bearings and a cooling system, and one that can cut metric threads and all that good stuff. But that costs money. And anyway, who could walk away from such a wonderful old lady as this? She is probably 110 years old and apparently would have been kept very busy during the First World War. Probably not used for mass production of anything, more likely in a workshop in an air base or something like that. Whatever her story, doubtless it's long and complicated, but she needs some respect and careful handling. Now, as I say, vital parts are missing for some functions, but the parts that are here seem to have survived remarkably well, considering her age and what she's been through. The headstock was sticky, but also loose, curiously, so I took it apart to see how worn the spindle was. There were some worn patches for sure, but not too bad, I think, and no burrs, which is a good thing. This is part of a reduction gearing system. I'll show you that in a bit. I was also thinking I'd put in a V-belt instead of a flat belt for better traction. And of course V-belts are a continuous loop, so you need to take the lathe apart to get one in. And I'm learning all sorts of interesting things as I explore this. They look perfect. There are no ball bearings anywhere on this lathe, just plain bearings or bushings, and these are tapered and get tighter as you screw the retaining ring on. There's a cavity under the bushing, so I guess that's a reservoir for the oil, so it never dries out. But it turns out I can't just put a V-belt in after all. The trouble is, this spindle with the cogs on it, it's not designed to come off easily. These are rivets, not screws, and I just don't want to risk breaking the cast iron support arms by tapping them out. So I'll have to thread through some sort of flat belt after all and join it together somehow. When that goes in, this little pin lines up with a little hole, and that goes in there. Then that hole there would give access to the oil, wouldn't it? There was a reservoir. There's only a nameplate, not a model number or a name, so I asked the friendly people on the Facebook Drummond lathe group, and they told me that this lathe was a 5-inch double height, though you could turn something 14 inches wide on it, so I'm not sure why it's called that. These date back to 1912 or something, and they were built in Surrey in England. This one would have been treadle powered originally, somebody pushing up and down with their foot, but someone's fitted a motor support at the back somewhere along the line. Oil seals and spacers and collars running on very fine threads. The headstock all went back together again all right, but only when I found the little numbers stamped onto the shaft and on the bushings and lined them all up. That allowed little locator pins to fit into matching recesses. Someone designed and made all this without computers and CNC machines. Hats off to those people. Old-fashioned hats. This is a drive cog for the automatic feed screw, but getting that going again is a project for another day. I don't need automatic feed. I'm just hoping to be able to do something useful when I turn a handle. This is a lock collar. I imagine I'll need to adjust these once it's all settled in again. Whilst reassembling this headstock, I figured out how the gear reduction mechanism works. It's brilliant. If you move the pulley, then these engage, of course, and in fact, this is going much slower. Let's work out how much slower it is. Isn't that wonderful? So it's a big reducer. Still got all the steps. Now, I know nothing at all about metalworking lathes. I've never used one ever, though I've done quite a lot on woodworking ones. I don't know about feeds and speeds, except that they depend on the diameter of the piece you're working on and the type of metal it is, of course. So there's a lot to learn, but the people on the lathe group told me that these bushings should run at a maximum of 750 RPM. So I found a 4-pole 1 horsepower motor which spins relatively slowly at 1500 RPM, and I set about building a mount for it. It needs to be able to slide backwards and forwards and move in and out from the lathe to accommodate the steps in the pulley. So I made something solid out of plywood that fits over the round bar mounted behind the lathe, and it almost worked. But foolishly, I hadn't allowed for one of the support arms Oh man. So I had to saw off one of the wooden stretchers. Then I made a plywood pulley for it and then turned that down afterwards, just spinning it on the motor. And then I just found some woven tape for a belt and just glued it together with contact adhesive and had a go. It was supposed to be a temporary belt while I found some leather and joiners, but it seems to work. I don't know if that's allowed. That bar there, it's basically that whole motor has to come up by about 5 millimeters. So I can remake the whole stock, I think. Ashley was around that day and we looked at it all together. I wonder when this last spun like this. That's at top speed. But it's nice though, isn't it? Again, I'm going to put it on the lowest speed now. Okay, so that's the... Oops. Ooh, there we go. So, yeah, so this, when it moves over, and you push that down then, so this is now going through a gear, this gear and this gear, and it reduces the speed of the main shaft. So let's try that on the super slow. Put it up here. Yeah. Only just enough room. See how slowly it's going now? Yeah. That's lovely, isn't it?
Because this one seems like it's spinning really fast.
Yeah, because that's the drive to the shaft. Yeah. This is just a gear off that part of it. And actually it's staying on. It's staying on quite well, the belt. So maybe there isn't anything wrong with it.
It sounds better now as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to reverse this again. Whoops. It's just so difficult. It's not close to it. It's just so close. That's all the... Maybe a bit... turn off the mode. Hang on. Running over to the conveniently located switch.
Emergency switch.
Emergency switch on the far side of the room. Okay, so move this over there. And then you have to put this little lever back in and make sure it stays in place. Yep. And then you have to lock this bit is free of this bit until you tighten up this little nut using a spanner, which now it's direct. These are linked together, or should be. So one can get a spanner, you see.
Clutch.
Yeah. So I turn it on now, and you'll see that this just hops off its pulley. Stay on. Good. Maybe just needed a bit of running in.
Much faster.
Much faster, then we can go faster and faster. Gorgeous, isn't it?
Lovely.
And I knew this chop would come in useful one day. back, let's see what happens. Ooh. It's better than I thought. Let's see what happens if we do the next step. We're going to try and get the saddle back on the bed. The bed.
With a magic light.
Oh yeah. First of all, find the bed. Well, if we can get this working, you know, wouldn't it be exciting? Yeah. Oh yeah. So these threaded bars, they have to go through the saddle. The saddle is a huge heavy casting with various attachments. It took two of us to manoeuvre it carefully into position so it would slide on. You can see why this is called a double height lathe. The saddle runs along the lower rails, but the tail stock runs on the top set. I wonder why. You see? The saddle is loose because the sheave isn't in yet. A sheave is a narrow plate that can be adjusted, so there's just enough clearance to allow travel, but not enough to allow wiggle. No wiggling allowed here. That's the idea anyway. The bolts locate in indents on the back of the sheave so it doesn't slide out again, and the whole thing is very satisfying. I think we better put some oil everywhere. It's one of my favourite jobs, putting oil everywhere. Saddle goes forward, saddle goes backwards, saddle goes forward, saddle goes backwards. It gets stiff in places, and that's a sure sign of wear. But perhaps for the level of machining that I'll be doing, it won't matter too much, because it will be a big and expensive job to re-level this bed.
Too tight? It's too tight now.
We adjusted the sheave as best we could, and then moved on to the next step. The cross slide is probably more worn than the saddle, but it went on all right. It also has a sheave to keep it snug on the rails. Unfortunately, I don't have the vital machine screws for it, and you can't just go and buy those because they're some weird old-fashioned imperial thread. Whilst I was looking for those, we fitted the top slide. Again, quite a bit of wear here. Ooh, sliding. Well, up to a point, but that's fine.
Yeah, it didn't want to slide, but I suppose you'd never.
Yeah, well,
yeah, you might go all the way to the end, but
cup holder. Ooh, lovely.
isn't that right?
Yeah, gorgeous.
This one was hollow, right?
And spent quite a long time freeing up the tail stock. So it's locked both ways.
Yeah.
So maybe it's got some little are they bolt heads?
No, that's out. That's forwards.
Nice. And then Ashley ground a chuck key. That worked. Great, thanks Ashley. It's getting smaller. But of course I was stuck without the cross-slide sheave bolts that keep the sheave in the cross-slide slot. Luckily we have a really good engineering works not too far from here with really helpful owners, and they found these for me. Perfect. Look at that. They fit perfectly. Again, lots of fine tuning till they were just tight enough, but not too tight. That rattle is caused by something else. There are lots of things on this lathe, and half of them are still a mystery to me. But sheaves I like. Time to try it all out for the first time in who knows how many years. As I say, I have never ever used a metalworking lathe, and Will, I'm sure, will show me how to do it properly, but I haven't time to wait for him because he's very busy, so I'm just going to have to wing it. The first thing is to make sure that the tailstock is lined up with the center of the workpiece. For some reason you can move it sideways quite a lot, but I don't know why. Anyway, I decided it was centered when it only made a single mark in the end of this bar and not a circle. Now, the center finder that was in the tailstock, as far as I know, is only for finding and drilling out the center of something and not for keeping it steady. So I had to get it out, but it didn't want to come out. It's a Morse taper, and I think it had gone in there to die, but not on my watch. I just got it free before the gas ran out. And luckily this thing that may or may not be called a live end, which comes from my woodworking lathe, has the same Morse taper size. So I was able to set up a short piece of mild steel between 2 points, and I found a stub of tool steel and ground it to a tapered point and tried it out. Not very well, to be honest, but that's mostly down to me and my tool sharpening abilities. There's quite a lot to learn about tool sharpening, but even though this was my first time, I was quite pleased to see that it did sort of cut. The workpiece got hot, though I did lubricate it, which I doubt is supposed to happen, is it? But if you happen to have a length of tool steel you're not using, 10mm square, please send it along and I will figure this grinding out, and then I'll have something really useful to show you. In the meantime, this old lady is back up on her feet again, perhaps not all singing and dancing yet, but maybe we're heading in the right direction.